Hello, my name is Arkadiusz Synovchik. I'm a philosophy student at Newcastle University, currently at an exchange at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. And today I'm here with Dr. Edwin Locke to interview him on the topic of induction in psychology. Hello, Dr. Locke.
Hello.
Edwin A. Locke is an American psychologist. He is the Dean's Professor Emeritus of Leadership and Motivation at the R.H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park. He received his BA from Harvard in 1960 and his PhD in industrial psychology from Cornell University in 1964. As stated by the Association for Psychological Science, Locke is the most published organizational psychologist in the history of the field. His pioneering research has advanced and enriched our understanding of work motivation and job satisfaction. The theory that is synonymous with his name, goal-setting theory, is perhaps the most widely respected theory in industrial organizational psychology. Dr. Locke published more than 336 chapters, notes, and articles in professional journals on such subjects as work motivation, job satisfaction, incentives, and the philosophy of science. He is also the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 13 books on topics such as the proper model of successful business people, proper study techniques, love, free will, and many others. Hello again, Dr. Locke.
Well, thank you for the introduction.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to interview such an interesting person.
I want to give credit on the goal setting theory to my colleague Gary Latham from the University of Toronto. We've worked together for 45 years in writing books together and publishing articles together. We also published separately from one another, but I have to give him credit as the co-developer of goal setting theory.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. You have written a number of very interesting academic papers which advocate the use of induction in psychology. It's very interesting since many would assume that, of course, science uses induction, and since psychology is a science, it uses induction. I mean, many people would find that uncontroversial. However, I think you would disagree, and here is my question. Is induction welcomed in psychology? And if it isn't, what are the consequences of that?
Here's how it works in the psychology journals and management journals. So you come up with a theory by deduction by drawing ideas from all kinds of places. Then you formulate a hypothesis. And then if they come out, you say, okay, theory's done. That's it. We validated a theory. Now, you can't validate a theory in one study or even 5 studies. And if you want to do scientific discovery, you can't start with deduction if there's nothing known about the subject to start with. So you might start with a narrow hypothesis, such as we did goal setting affects performance. That's not a theory. That's just one idea. If you want to build a theory over that, you need to come up with a set of a process. And there's a lot of things involved in the process. For example, you want to talk about what domain are you interested in? Latham and I were interested in what affects high performance. And the 2 dominant approaches when I started my graduate work were Freudianism, which is everything subconscious coming from instinct. Secondly, behaviorism, which all motivation is from the outside and you're conditioned. You don't have any choices. You're just conditioned by your environment. So I thought the approach was very, very limiting and very not useful. So one of my professors at Cornell said, why not look at conscious motivation to start with? We'll worry about the subconscious later. Let's worry about conscious motivation. And he said, he wrote a book called Intentional Behavior. It was His name was T.A. Ryan. And I said, and it was in a textbook by him and one of the earliest women industrial psychologists, Pat Smith. And in it was one graph done by a professor in England in 1935. And the graph compared specific goal with a general goal of do your best. And the graph showed the specific goal was way better. And I said to my advisor and said to myself, maybe we should approach motivation that way. So let's start studying conscious goals. And I did that for my dissertation, and it came out. I did some more work with Latham and with my assistant, Judy Bryan, and that came out. And people started to say, this might be a good way to approach the subject because it works. And there were a lot of nonsense theories in industrial psychology about motivation that didn't come out. So that's how we got started. But then it required a theory building process. It had to go through stages. So this is not one study, but 50 years of work. And when people saw that goal setting worked, they got other people interested. So the literature became very large. Instead of just one study, there were hundreds. So Latham and I in 1994, 1997, wrote a book putting together all the known studies into a model. So we went through all the aspects of theory building based on over 400 studies. So our approach was totally different because if you wanted to get published, most journals said, I'll take the one study and don't try to keep doing it because that's not original. I want a new study. For the next article, I want a totally different subject. And said, okay, that one came out. I want a totally different subject. They didn't want progressive theory building. But we were able to do that anyway by having enough people do it in enough journals. So do you want me to go through the stages?
I'm sure we'll come back to it. Now, let me ask clarifying questions. So, in a way, you advocate induction, use of induction psychology, but in another sense, you aren't doing that because many people could argue that this process of conjecture and making predictions is what induction is. Your idea is basically that this is not how induction looks like. It's backed up by a long process of study in which we gather data, which then gives us evidence for some hypothesis, which we then can state and try out. So you advocate the use of induction in psychology in a sense that this is how induction at the basic level of description should look like.
Yeah, let me put it this way. Induction is gathering data, okay, from observation. And you can start with a hypothesis, which I did, but that's not a theory in my mind. So if a theory involves an integrated process, and the journals do not support programmatic research. They want single shot studies. And then if you want to do more, they say, well, you've already done one study, let's move on to something else. And they don't have any idea, most psychologists don't have an idea of the process of theory building. They want to go over what the steps are yet?
We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. Sure. What's a question I would like to ask here is about the practical consequences of that deductive-like approach to induction in psychology. And namely, in one of your papers advocating use of induction in psychology, you mentioned that goal-setting theory couldn't be developed under today's standards. Could you maybe expand briefly on that?
Because the any given journal, like the Journal of Applied Psychology, after a certain point, wouldn't take any more studies. That's been done. Unfortunately, people around the world have had their own journals, and so they're able to put it in many different places. But they didn't want to develop a systematic, programmatic theory, because they said you have your study and it came out, your theory's validated, so that's it. And we
Yeah,
wanted to say,
and
and I wrote an early article saying was it not a theory, like a pre-theory of goal setting, in which we summarized 12 studies. We said this isn't yet theory. We called it toward a theory of goal setting. That was many, many decades ago. But it's not a theory. And people were shocked by that. How can you say that? You have 12 studies in one article. Isn't it over? No. That's not a theory yet. There were so many other elements to discuss. And also, if you're a professor, it can be hard to get tenure if you want to do programmatic, because it can take more than 5 years or 6 years. American universities usually come up for tenure in 6 years, and you can't build much in 6 years. So you can get promoted by doing starting point. But even if they do that, then they stop. Well, I better move to something else, because I've already researched all there is to know about this subject. And they don't. So the idea of going over decades of doing this is almost unheard of. Albert Bandura is a positive example, and we were good friends, and we cited each other's work, and both of us were theory builders, and both of us incorporated the other's variable into our theory building process. So that was a nice thing to find, but it was very uncommon.
yeah, that idea that induction takes time, I think, is certainly that we can find in the history of science, for example, with Charles Darwin, who spent literally decades before finally publishing his theory.
25 years to write that
Yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah.
And he didn't know anything about genes, of course. He did it all from other data. And of course, so it wasn't complete. It was inductive. He never heard of genes. That came later. So now we know more. But this was a great example of induction across a wide variety of data experiments, putting together in a package.
Yes. So now maybe you could expand on how the process of theory building looks like in general or specifically in psychology.
Number one, what's your domain? Because what do you want to explain? Our domain was very clear. It was, how do you account for differences in performance? What causes high performance? That was our domain. It was first just work, but later we said this domain applies to success in other parts of your life and research too. So the domain was always performing better, and that was what our focus was. The next, to have a clear definition. Now, you may know that definitions are kind of passé. Many articles you read with none. And if you push people into it, they'll say, well, definitions are arbitrary. Modern philosophy says it's a matter of personal opinion. Or they'll say, my definition of X is Professor Jones's scale. So how did Professor Jones get that? So, and then you read Professor Jones' scale, and it's chaos. So that's how the whole thing goes. So we had a very simple definition. The goal is the object or aim of an action. So one sentence. And Bandura's the same way. Self-efficacy is the conviction or confidence you can achieve a certain level of performance or outcome. So no convoluted, no vagueness, very explicit definition of what we meant by the concept. Then there was the issue of measurement. You know, measurement's kind of a mess. Everyone has a scale for everything. And often they overlap and they try to compete on whose is the best, and it goes on and on and on. So we had a very simple method of measuring goals, which, first of all, if it was an assigned goal, try to achieve level of performance X. That's the goal. Later, we came to discover the best method of measuring a self-set goal would be what's the lowest level of performance you'd be satisfied with. The best measure to use. It would include assigned goals, because you could say, here's what he told me to do. Here's my minimum acceptable performance. Or if it was self-set, this is I wouldn't be satisfied on anything lower than this. So clear measurement, no convoluted scales with 50 items on them. Then replication. Now, a lot of the replication idea in psychology is very, very misguided. And I see this all the time. Say, so-and-so said that after 5 minutes of work, your energy becomes depleted. And so somebody said, let's replicate that over 25 universities all around the world. So what did they do for replication? They used one task, one time limit, which was very short, and one set of instructions. And not surprisingly, didn't come out that well. Why are you doing an international replication of a 5-minute study done with one task and one set of instructions? So our approach was replication with deliberate variation. Deliberate variation. Now, if you wanted exact replication, everything has to be identical, but then you can't generalize. Not in psychology. How do you generalize from one tiny task lasting 5 minutes? And that's all you've got. So we wanted generality. So we used about 90 different tasks, and others did. We used subjects from everywhere, all over the world, at different ages. We weren't slightly bit interested in race or gender because we thought it was a universal principle. We had different settings, self-set goals, assigned goals, laboratory settings, and business settings. So that was variation across settings. And then variation across dependent variables. What outcome measures would you use? Number of performance on what? Or speed, or quality, all of those are outcomes. So we had different measures, different tasks, different subjects, different settings, because induction requires generalization. That's why one 5-minute task is not useful. And typically those international things come out in a very disappointing way because they did it too soon, did it way too soon. Then we all know that a theory, even with some variation in validity, doesn't work without qualifications. So then we put in our 1990 book, moderators. Moderators are interactions or limiting conditions. And there was enough data to put chapters on those. So one moderator was, do you have the knowledge or skill to reach this goal? Another was feedback. You need feedback to track your progress. Another was commitment. What causes commitment? Commitment is caused by self-efficacy. That's from Bandura. And commitment is whether you're getting a value, whether the outcome was valuable to you or important, which might involve incentives. And then in a business setting, you need organizational support because you need time, you need help, you need money, you need freedom to work on something. So we put in those moderators as saying, if you want to make goal setting work, you've got to take account of the moderators. Make sure that people have the knowledge, make sure they have feedback, make sure they're committed, make sure they have organizational support if needed. So it's not a theory of everything divorced from context. It's a thing that works in a given context with moderators, which are typically the same concept of interactions. The next step was, is goal setting theory tied into other theories in any logical way? So they could help each other. And in general, they were not, except for Bandura's self-efficacy theory. So we incorporated self-efficacy into goal theory, and he incorporated goal setting into self-efficacy theory. We both appreciated each other's. Bandura and I published together one time. But so this is what we call scientific integration. So the initial integration is put together all the studies, okay? That's the induction I talked about earlier. Then let's tie it to other theories, which are complementary, which make it stronger if the other theories are valid. So that's what we did. And then finally, people said to us, Latham and I, how do you know goal setting works in the real world? You just did a lab study. So Latham said, okay, I'm going to do some field studies. He did about 9 of those, and it worked perfectly well. And then people started to use it so he did studies in businesses. And then other companies picked it up, such as Google and other places, to try in their businesses. And now, I don't know how much credit we get, but of course, goal setting is ubiquitous in business, but it can be used in other domains also. A friend of mine in the Netherlands use it in psychotherapy. They have goals for the client. They work together with the therapist. So the application is, oh yeah, and people have used it in sports for coaching sports teams and so on. So that's what we call theory building process. And so in our, I don't know if you want this later, I can send it to you, our final overview article, which was published in the UK, was putting all of what I said to you together in one article. And by the way, going back to our initial conversation, we sent this to Academy of Management Review, which is a theory journal. They're having a special issue on induction. So we sent it to them, and using my own crude words, basically they said, F you. I don't know what you're talking about. What is this induction stuff? AMR, American Management Review, American, is all deduction, all deduced theories, everything. And it's been going on for decades. I don't know a single, and none of them were validated. They're all deductive theories. I don't know a single AMR article that it was ever validated in reality. After, I don't know, 50 years of publications, I don't know a single one. I don't know a single business that's picked up and say, I'm using that AMR article because it's going to be a big benefit to my company. It's theory, deductive theory is written for who? Other professors. So they write for each other, not for business.
Okay.
So that was not surprising. So I was very happy to get the UK journal on theory building that loved it.
That's at least some good outcome. And given all that you have said about the problems with deductive theory building and the things that you have said about the proper way to build theory, could you say about the ways that induction could be more welcomed in psychology? What could be done, for example, with at the institutional level with journals and things like that?
Well, tell the journal editors they got a brain transplant. They will not, will almost refuse to do it. One problem is if you do induction, you need many articles, and they say, I want something new. I want something new. What's new? We already knew that. Get something new. So people, after a certain point, don't do it. So, so they'd have to be encouraged to do. Put it this way: welcome programmatic research. And when you say,
Okay.
when they see you're doing this again, they say, "Oh, wonderful! Now do it more. Get the moderators, get the mediators, get the generalizability. Okay, now you send that in and say, well, now do it more. What other subjects you have? What about other countries? So goal setting has been done in 6 or 7 countries. So that's useful information. We never broke it down by gender or race. I don't think it's really relevant in terms of the principles, but maybe so. So the journal editors would have to welcome programmatic research, but by and large, they don't. In terms of getting promoted in academia in the US, basically what we used to tell incoming faculty is one thing. You need approximately 5 articles, published articles in top-rated journals, and you'll get tenure. If you don't get it. So we told, and this was not in our control, this was a higher level. So we told our new faculty, I said, look, I want to get promoted, 5 articles in top journals, and you probably have a very good chance of making it. So the powers that be, they don't care if in a business school if your work is useful to business people. I remember going to I was a speaker at a ongoing graduate student conference in the Academy of Management, and the speaker before me said, "Now, I want to tell you what we do." He was a former journal editor. What we do is do research that's useful for business people. So he left. My turn. Said, "I'm really sorry to tell you guys, it's not true. Most businessmen would never read our professional articles. Even the empirical articles or data, they're filled with pages of stats, very complex stats. What business leaders going to go through pages of stats from one study to find something useful for his company? They're not even causal data, they're just stats data. And so it reduces to business faculty are writing for each other to get in good journals written by other faculty. And you don't get too much written for practically usefulness. Maybe Harvard Business Review, you're more likely to find not too much theory building, but at least things that are useful for managers or business people. So that whole approach is kind of interesting. I'm very amazed that we got where we did because there's so much bias against programmatic research.
Okay, thank you. That's very insightful. So to sum up, the moral is induce, and I think it highlights something very important, namely that uh, philosophers often look for specific norms of induction, of drawing justified conclusions from the data, and they often don't appreciate how simply using induction instead of other methods is beneficial. And here to our audience, I would like to recommend a book, The Philosophical Breakfast Club, part of which highlights how the introduction of induction to economics to replace the prevalent then deductive methods brought about a complete revolution in the subject.
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know about that that group. But what I would say to people in my field is, you think you have an idea that will be beneficial and useful, start by trying something. I mean, literally. You know, I had a doctor researcher, famous doctor researcher, who's since passed away, said, send me an article you wrote with an introduction. It has an introduction. I want to read it. Their introductions were like 2 pages. Then we said, now we're going to look at how this thing affects immune system. And then later on, they'd put it together in a later article, kind of inductively integrated. In my field, the introduction can be 15 pages of convoluted deductions from all around the world. I mean, all around the place. I had one editor said, I'm using some previous work here, but also I'm trying stuff and I can't predict what's going to happen. So this is evil according to the norms. And the editor said, I like your study. So for the ones where you don't have a theory, make one up. In your introduction, make it up and put it in your introduction, because otherwise you can't accept it. That's how bad it is. So I say, if you want to try something, then expand on it in the ways I talked about. Then you can build a program, if you can get it published.
Okay, so I like to move to the next question, namely to go into the specifics, to more into the specifics of the inductive process of theory building. Namely, from your work, one can easily see that you are very explicitly drawing upon philosophy, or to put it differently, that you are very philosophy conscious. Could you say what role did philosophy play in your work in psychology, and what role should it have in the field?
My philosophy came from philosopher Ayn Rand. And what did I get from her? Number one, what she called axioms of philosophy. Axioms of philosophy are things that are self-evident to direct experience and can't be contradicted without accepting them in the process. One of them, for instance, is reality. If you deny reality, how are you going to do that? Because it's say reality is an illusion. How did you get the concept of illusion unless you knew what reality is? So reality is a starting point. Consciousness is an axiom. All knowledge requires consciousness. You can't have knowledge discovery with no consciousness. So it's a starting point. Behaviorists rejected consciousness completely. Just wanted conditioning. Free will, which is the capacity to make choices involving the use of the rational faculty, which is your capacity to make concepts. And then Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, how you make objective concepts. The history of the philosophy has been big battles between what a concept is, and it's never ending. But she made clear, I can't do that here. She wrote a book on Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, how you form valid concepts. And therefore, when you do that, you can form clear objective definitions, and then you can proceed to study the formula. If you don't have valid concepts, you're doomed. You can't go anywhere with that. So those are the things I took from her. I didn't take the content of goal theory from objectivism. It was the foundation. It was the foundation for my work, and it was very valuable because I had to oppose early on. Behaviorism was dominant, and I had to oppose it. I opposed it from the very beginning of my career, and maybe helped destroy it. It fell apart in the 70s. It would dominate the field for probably 50, 60 years, and finally it died. An awful slow death, but it did die. So, and then there was Freudianism. Now, the takeaway for us from Freud would be all motivation is subconscious. So if you want to measure motivation, you use projective tests. A projective test would be like showing you a picture. One of them might be a circus performer, and you as the subject would write a story about the picture. The story would be scored and then used to predict performance on a task. It doesn't not ever work, but it's very unreliable as a guide. And the projective tests, borderline, they're not totally useless, but they're very difficult and tricky to use in psychology. I don't know if you've heard of David McCullough. He's a famous Harvard professor, McCullough, and he wrote about the need for achievement. He wrote books on it. He studied the development of civilizations, and he used projective tests for all measurements, or the equivalent of projective tests, which I won't go into. And so he retired and was forced to retire from Harvard because of his age. He went to another school. So I wrote him and I said, I have some students who want to teach, want to do an experiment. And you said entrepreneurship is very relevant to need for achievement. You'd like to be on the committee? He said, sure, I'll be in the committee. He said, okay, would you pick the pictures we're going to use? He said, sure, I'll pick the pictures. He said, would you score you have a company that scores the pictures. Would you score the pictures? He said, sure, I'll do that. So we got a group of entrepreneurs, gave them the pictures. There were only 4. He wanted only 4 pictures, which shocked me. You'll see why in a minute. And then we also asked conscious goals, with people in the, I think, printing or reproduction Xerox companies who reproduced, in the days when you went to the Xerox and everything was reproduced on Xerox. And so we used them as the subjects they were all entrepreneurs. I said to McCullough, is this sample okay? He said, oh yeah, it sounds perfect. So we did a 2-year longitudinal follow-up with the student I had. So what happened? So of the 4 TATs, one of them came out negative. So instead of a positive correlation, one came out negative. And they said earlier to McCullough, they said, are you sure 4 pictures is enough for the subconscious? He said, oh yes, I've had your lifelong experience. So one came out negative. So we had to trash that one. So we used the other 3 and it didn't work. Then we had conscious goals for 2 years ahead and they came out great. So then I wrote McCullough and said, so here's what happened. I'm sorry that TAT didn't come out. He said, okay, well, I'm going to plot it on a graph and look for curvilinear relationships. And I said, David, you can't do curvilinear relationships after the fact. By seeing what the curve looks like, that if you want to do that, you got to replicate it. You can't just pick out parts of the data that works and So then he passed away, and that was it. So, and then at AT&T, they did studies also. The projective measures came out quite poorly for the dependent variable of being promoted. The conscious variable came out very well over 25 years. So I'm not against the subconscious at all, because Latham has studied that with great success. But it's very tricky to use subconscious measures like the TAT. So, so those were the two influences, Skinner and Freud. So I had to break away from both of those to do goal setting theory in Latham also. So that's where we are.
When looking at your work, I think another way in which your philosophical background could help you is in your recent 2022 article on management as intellectual primarily.
Oh, leadership.
I leadership
Yeah.
as
Oh, yeah.
intellectual. I think you are much more likely to come up to such a conclusion if you study people acknowledging existence of their consciousness contra
Yeah.
various behaviors
Yeah.
like approaches.
Yeah. I want to tell you another story about that article. So I tried to go to a leadership journal. It said, I don't have a theory. This is not a theory article. It's just observations. Total observations, no theory. Don't pretend to have a theory. Just intellectual observations that might promote research. And the editor said, no, you can't do that. I said, why not? He said, you don't have a theory. I said, I know I don't. This is a think point. This is a think article, not a theory article. And he said, I said, well, there's no theory that covers what I cover. Said, well, you got to find one. I said, sorry, I'm not doing that. There isn't any. So I went to a C level, you have ABC. Went to a C level journal. I said, what do you think of this? And the guy said, well, it's not exactly what we look for, because he was in on the traditional thing. He says, but since you're so well known, we'll accept it. Otherwise, it would have never been published. But it was solely for the purpose of people thinking along a wider track when they do leadership research. For example, remember there were about 25 or 30 things that I had listed as things you have to do intellectually. You read the article, right?
Yeah, I have.
About 25 or 30 things. They said, well,
there's a lot of that.
So if you wanted to do research, you could measure self-efficacy for those 25 or 30 things. And then you could predict success. That is very, very brief, I know. But I'm not against thinking outside the permitted stuff, but articles with ideas to me is fine, but I don't consider my article a theory. Just observations. That's all. So, but the head of the Leadership Quarterly, whatever, that he wouldn't touch it. Typical Academy of Management Social Science attitude. Got to have a theory. I can give you a more ridiculous example. But 25. Do we have time?
Maybe it would be better to move further. We
Okay.
have
I don't
some
want to
material
take up your time.
also to cover.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're definitely very philosophy conscious. Do you think other psychologists are also consciously drawing upon philosophy? What
No,
is
not at all.
the result of their relationship with philosophy? I
Not
think
at
you
all.
have okay. And
Sorry. Go ahead.
what about Karl Popper, which you explicitly mentioned in your philosophy of science articles?
Popper was against induction. I said, you can't do anything with it. He was against causality. And his view of theory building was to disprove ideas. Now, this is crazy in every sense of the word. You can't build a theory by proving something to be wrong. So you do a theory by offering positive evidence. Then you look for contradictions, of course. And then if you see what I did in goal setting theory with life, if you find a contradiction in a result, as an inductive person, say, okay, maybe we need more moderators. Okay, maybe we left out a moderator. We did this. Somebody in Israel discovered feedback as a moderator. Wasn't in there initially. And so we put that into goal theory. So we built it into it. We added to the theory through induction. Now, if you try to do a deductive theory, here's what happens. I've seen this happen many times. The researcher gets enraged. Because I want my theory is the theory and it's done. So don't you dare try to attack me. And I've seen them get infuriated and insult people. So it makes the theorist defensive. Because if my theory is finished, I did it by deduction, or maybe one study, and you can't do that to me. So then they get in big fights. As an inductive theorist, our view was, oh, you found something new, great, we'll add it to the theory. There's no need to be defensive, no need to feel put upon, no need to feel rejection, there's no need to feel a failure. Because
Do you think
when
that
we find an error, we simply add it in. Sorry.
yeah, and do you think that Karl Popper is somehow influenced psychology to move in that deductive-like approach?
It's a good question. I don't know how many people have read Popper. Most people in my field, I've found, have no interest in philosophy at all. Don't want to have anything to do with it. Don't care about it. Don't read about it. Don't cite philosophers when they're defending their views. So what happens when you do that? What you do is you use philosophy that's sort of in the air already from previous philosophers, but without too much thinking or criticism. So they're not hostile to it so much as they're not interested. And it's partly because philosophy has a bad name because of all the crazy people who have written about it since the beginning of time. Aristotle, I think, was the best. But Plato said, you can't even trust the evidence of the senses. So imagine a science where you reject all information from the senses. Well, you've destroyed science if you really take that. You've destroyed science. So you can say the history of psychology, of philosophy, or even of the world, was a competition between Plato and Aristotle. Plato was for reason, but not for the senses. Aristotle said it starts with the senses, then you build concepts. I think was the correct way to go. So I think that Plato was one of the reasons why people thought it was somewhat arbitrary, because if it's by deduction, how did Plato say you discover concepts? Some kind of incomprehensible intuition. Can't get it from the senses. So some kind of intuition. And he said, that's where you get the key ideas, and that's how you validate them. This doesn't work too well. So there's a Platonic implicit influence by Platonic. And I think there's also the later philosophers like Popper, which they probably never read, but his influence has been around too. But I've never had anyone, when I've written philosophy of science articles and published them, no one's ever attacked me. They just ignore me.
Yeah, I think it's right that psychologists are not directly influenced by Popper, but they may be indirectly.
Yes.
because among various scientists, the name of Popper is thrown around basically casually.
Yep.
And one ironic sign that they haven't read Popper is that if they read Popper, they would know that according to Popper, there is no such thing as proving theory false. Popper says that there is no such thing as evidence at all, either positive or negative. So there is no such thing as proving or disproving something.
Popper said you could you should and could disprove hypotheses.
Actually, he did
Why?
use such words, but he didn't mean what most people mean by that.
Didn't he
One,
falsification as a primary method?
yes, yes, but here's the problem with Popper, which was highlighted by a philosopher, D.C. Stove, namely that Popper uses words, success words like knowledge, discovery, falsification, disproof, or even logic of scientific discovery, the title of one of his books. According to Stove, Popper uses those words, but he uses them without the the meaning that implies cognitive success. So he basically redefines all these words, and one can see that in the title of one of Popper's book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. And what's the conclusion of a book with that title? That there is no such thing as logic of scientific discovery. Uh, so a lot of, according to Stove, and I think it's plausible, a lot of appeal and popularity of Popper derives from the fact that people don't know that he used words like knowledge, discovery, disproof, falsification in a completely different manner. Uh,
You know more. You know more than I do. I didn't know that other work at all that you're talking about. I read Popper for the article I wrote on induction because he was so considered like an axiom by philosophers of science, and so I read it because I wanted to show what he said, what I thought he meant was not gonna, couldn't possibly work. But I did not know about what you said. That's something else.
yeah, that's something that even many philosophers who teach Popper are not aware. But that's not the topic. Our topic here. I'm simply serving as an additional commentator to what you're saying.
Okay.
And you basically said that psychologists are disregarding philosophy, putting it aside. And another interesting thing that they could notice if they were engaged with philosophy is that in the late 20th century philosophy, philosophers of science have put the process of scientific discovery, uh, they conceived it as a legitimate subject of philosophical debate, whereas Popper basically said coming up with an idea is something irrational or irrational, and we can study it. However, as I said, in the late 20th century, philosophers took the opposite approach, and today it's something basically, at least by most philosophers of science, they acknowledge that the process of discovery is a legitimate topic of discussion, and some of them even try to come up with some norms of improving the process of
Oh,
discovery.
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. By the
And
way, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'll finish quickly. And even when one goes back into, let's say, 19th century philosophy, one has some such prominent philosopher of science as William Hull, who was basically friendly, who was friendly to studying the process of inductive discovery, and and who who basically would highlight to them that induction has to take a lot of time and requires a preparation of the mind. One can paraphrase Hull's idea in a way that only the mind who is prepared to see something will see it.
Oh, I totally agree
And
with
that
that.
takes time.
And induction does take a long time. You know what I mean by CRISPR in medicine?
I've heard, of course.
Replacing genes with other
Yeah.
genes. Now, I read a book about the Nobel Prize winning American Dudna, and it was very interesting. Their procedure was to constantly try stuff. I thought it was wonderful. That's what I did. And then if they got puzzled, they wouldn't write a theory article. Say, okay, quickly, I'm going to do another study. And then somebody at another lab would say, oh, I'm going to do another study to expand on that. And they study after study after study. And finally, they put together, it's not over yet, but they put together something that involves knowledge. There's a lot yet to be discovered. So that was
So,
a great example of a inductive medical researcher.
So the moral again is induce. Very related issue. For example, to what you were saying about qualifying a theory, finding moderators and mediators is the issue that psychology, as well as other special sciences, is widely thought to use the ceteris paribus clause in its generalizations, the clause that all things are being equal or that excluding all interfering factors. Could you maybe expand a little bit? And philosophers often see a problem in specifying in what context a given generalization holds. So maybe could you expand a little bit about how, while working on goal-setting theory, you identified the context in which it holds?
Well, the main thing was replication with variation. And if we found someone didn't come out, we immediately went back to the theory and revised it. You can see that in our 1990 book, goal setting. So that was our approach. So we welcome new discoveries, and then, as I said, if we found something didn't come out, we went back and clarified.
So
that we don't claim to be omniscient. For instance, in our studies, we don't say goal setting theories starts with the fact that the person's conscious. We don't put it in there because it's too obvious. But that's a context. We didn't put in person can't be suffering from terminal cancer or be on drugs that make them comatose, blah blah blah. It has to be certain things you have to take as a given. But within the context of trying to achieve something in the real world, what are the moderators? I didn't talk about mediators, but we discovered those too. So there's always a context for everything. And you get into moderators, you put in the obvious things you have to look at, but we can't put in everything known in the universe into it. You couldn't do anything. So you take certain things as given, and then you proceed from there.
Okay, so when you encountered a boundary condition under which GST works, you didn't think that your theory was wrong when you found a context in which it doesn't hold, for example.
We thought it was incomplete.
Okay,
so
yeah.
theory as presented so far, needs add-ons. So it wasn't 100% correct. As stated, we need add-ons to need expansion. And by the way, people think you shouldn't do any studies on goal setting because it's now settled. Actually, I could think of 100 experiments you could do on it, even now, such as the interaction between goals and learning. Actually, Latham did some studies on how about learning goals, since knowledge is important. So that was an add-on. And then I didn't mention earlier that Latham has, we talked about subconscious, but non-Freudian subconscious. Talked about, if you heard the idea of giving people ideas by I'm trying to think of priming. You've heard of priming? Have you heard of priming? Priming is you're doing a goal setting study and you show them a picture of a person running in a race to allegedly prime them for achievement motivation. Or might do it. Just an idea. And so Latham's done studies on priming, and that's bringing stuff out of the subconscious. Priming works, but there's a lot more to be learned from it. For instance, priming may require conscious mediators, which Latham has studied some. You can see that there's so many ways to grow that could be studied.
So I think one conclusion that you have drawn in your articles and that you seem to imply here is that when you find boundary conditions of a theory or to speak differently of a hypothesis, it's not like you have falsified it. You have simply found a context under which it holds or doesn't hold.
Right. So it's always an issue of adding new knowledge. And you can't have a theory of everything. Einstein wanted one, but he didn't get one right to integrate all the four forces. It never succeeded. No one else has. So you can't have a theory of everything, and you can't have a theory of every context you might meet in the world. So you add when you have evidence that something is important, and put that in, and you grow the theory. You grow the theory from more induction.
So while being in the process of theory building or developing a theory, to speak more generally, you have an implicit premise that acknowledges that there may be some, or there can or may be some interfering factor or a boundary condition. And if it arises, I will simply qualify my conclusions.
Yeah. Well, if you're known as an inductive person, but in psychology, an awful lot of people were deductive, and as I said, they got enraged. He disagreed because they weren't inductive and they didn't want qualifications. So I think part of it is when you present the theory as inductive, you make it clear how you did it. And so for our 1990, sorry, I gave the date wrong earlier, the 1990 goal setting book, we said, here's what we know from the 400 or so studies. And we had some places where we said, here's some things that we don't know in parts of the book, but they knew, then they knew we were inductive people. So hopefully that would free them up to approach it without fearing us and without worrying that they were committing a sacrilege. And it's good if a researcher who's inductive will not be as defensive, because your whole approach is different. In a deductive theory, you did it, and it's got to be it. We've finished. We did our study. It's finished. So that's why people get angry. Inductive theory, you say, it's an open theory, open to new relevant knowledge.
So the Popperian-like approach to scientific reasoning, instead of guarding science against rationalization, ad hoc hypothesis, actually encourages those.
Yeah.
Okay,
Imagine you're a biologist and somebody sends an article, probably they have somewhere. I'm going to do a theory of cancer. The year is 1960. You're going to think of anything so stupid in the world. Do you know how many tens, hundreds of thousands of studies have been done to study cancer? Because it's so complex. And each study, if the studies are valid, sometimes they're not valid. They're valid, you add an increment. So little by little by little, it's way, way more complicated. So theory of cancer is so ridiculous. That's the kind of things, people would write if they're deductive people. Could say, well, it's all due to the immune system. Okay, I'll accept that. Probably true, but that hasn't got us anywhere. Let's get with it. What about the immune system? And what part of it works? And against what cells does it work? Blah, 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 blah. So I think a lot of deductive work is pretentious. Trying to do too much with what you have.
It's also all very insightful. And one of the methodological problems that you point out with that deductive-like approach also is creating baseless hypotheses without evidence to even get started with, while presenting the hypothesis initially. And my question would be, I don't know whether it lies within an area that you are comfortable with speaking about, but one idea that comes to my mind is whether such an approach of making hypothesis without evidence doesn't have negative psychological consequences. For example, baseless what if questions that cause anxiety. Is it something that you would like to speak about?
Well, gets very interesting because I think a good place to talk about in that sense is environmentalism. Now, it's almost it's an interesting field because I read widely in the field, and I believe in global warming, but I believe that it's gone slightly crazy in many ways, and like the people who say the Earth will be destroyed in 10 years, or in 1990 they said we'll run out of oil before 2000, or we'll run out of food. Century, we're going to run out of food now. So everything's going to go to hell. These get a lot of attention, but they're not well grounded. So But you get the popular press going on this tangent. For example, I think there's real global warming, and it could be harmful, but is it really the right thing to use 3 things to fix it, which aren't trustworthy? So doesn't your cells don't work if there's no sunlight, your windmills don't work if there's no wind, and battery backup is very limited usefulness. And so you have 3 untrustworthy things backing up other untrustworthy things and requiring huge subsidies. Now, my idea there is, why not use one thing that's totally reliable? Nuclear. And people get hysterical. I think it would be way better than the stuff they're doing now. And people get enraged if you mention it. So I think outside the square of it. But so people can have a problem which is legitimate, for which they suggest the wrong solution. Not impressed with the solution to the warming thing. But, not too many people will agree with me. I can't prove it, but the data indicates that it will work 24/7. Period. Unless there's
the reason is why I'm asking about the psychological consequences of such deductive like approach is because when I read your articles about inductive theory building, goal setting theory, you said, for example, that one of the elements of goal setting theory is that goals should be specific, nor abstract or vague. And you have also mentioned Aaron Beck, who claimed that that depressives overgeneralize, and all of that put together seems to imply that a healthy psychology is an inductive psychology, and this seems so, especially in management, given in the leadership, given your 2022 article in which you have enlisted a whole 30 somewhat points of how a leader has to make good inductive conclusions. So my question would be, do you think one can conclude that inductive thinking is in general psychologically beneficial?
Well, think of induction versus deduction. So let's take Socrates as a man. You know that one? All men are mortal. You know that the classic deduction. Everyone uses it.
Yeah. Everyone.
So people don't notice that part of the deduction requires induction. So Socrates is a man. That's direct sense perception. No problem there. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. All men are mortal is an induction. So you can't even do deduction without the foundation of induction. That's in some of my articles. That's not mentioned either.
Yeah, that was definitely there. So maybe let's move to some closing points. One last topic that I would like to ask about is about the role of concepts in psychological or scientific induction in general. In recent decades, the role of concepts in induction has been put more and more into focus. So is there some way that is there some role that concepts played in your work that you would like to point out?
Let me go back to the very, very beginning. Animals can see the world and guide actions based on sense perception. Okay, that's how they survive. If the environment's too threatening, they don't know what to do, and they die out. Humans, based on what's happened through evolution of I think 6 million years past the chimps, they can use sensory information to formulate concepts, objective concepts. Ayn Rand wrote a whole book on objectivist epistemology, showing how valid concepts are formulated. So the idea of a science with no concept, you might as well be in comatose. You can't go anywhere. You can't get to first base. You can't even go up at the plate and swing. You're dead. So all science requires concept. All of it.
Okay, so
all human progress
to put
is concept. So it's very important to have valid concepts, or you're just screwed. You're doomed for life.
to put the question in a different way, do you think there are some concepts in psychology that harm its development?
That are what? Harmless or harmful? Did you say?
Do you think there are some concepts in psychology that harm the progress of science of psychology?
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it. I always think in terms of valid concepts. Like introspection, was forbidden by the behaviors. I think it's a very, very critical concept in psychology. But without it, psychology couldn't even exist. Introspection
You
is
also
not.
mentioned. Please continue. Please continue.
It's not directly relevant to physics because atoms don't introspect. But to understand psychological concepts, you have to do it by introspection. So it's more crucial as a method there than anywhere else. Not irrelevant. It's relevant even to romance. I'm talking about the sciences. But so psychology rejected this for a long time. It set it back. But I don't know if you know this. Psychologists used to smuggle it in by not saying it. They called it verbal self-reports. This is really funny. That came out in 1964, which is as behaviorism was gradually fading away. And people wanted to get in that. They couldn't say it. They wanted to give questionnaires, which require introspection. So they say, we did a self-report on self-efficacy, and self-report on self-efficacy predicted performance. But they wouldn't dare say self-report was based on introspection, which it is, right? So
You have also criticized the concept of emotional intelligence. Is there something you would like to mention in regard to that?
That was a huge. Well, at first it came out as like a magic wand, and I remember one article trying to press it into our consciousness with a long article, and I think he had 25 meanings of the term, 25 definitions. Now, right away, you got any concept with 25 definitions, you are doomed. It means it has no meaning at all. But it included 25 concepts from all over management. They wanted to show you how sophisticated they were. But it became unintelligible. Then there were multiple scales on it which didn't even necessarily agree with one another. If you wanted to use intelligible terms, you might have said, which they didn't, skill and introspection, which is valid. It's a good thing for humans to have. including managers.
And
So, but
introspection is definitely.
that's not how it came out. And so it became almost a faddish concept. It's less popular now. I read a recent review article on it with data, and so it's expanded to from one thing to at 4 different scales, but underneath 4 different scales were about 30 subscales. I said, no, this isn't going anywhere. Then of the 4 subscales, which combined other subscales, they got a very small correlation with some kind of outcome and nothing for the others. So I think it's a fad who's has been distorted by trying to be over-inclusive. They wanted the guy who wrote the book wanted famous, and he said, "This is the big thing in science now. This is it," and didn't work out too well. So I'm not opposed at all to a legitimate concept, which is good introspection. But I don't like these blanket terms that include everything. When you include everything, you include nothing. That's the problem.
Sure.
I wrote an article commenting on this, and some of the rebuttal was, yeah, Locke's got a good point there. It's right. It's too broad. And they tried to fix it, but it's still too broad. And what's the one? What's the one that's big today on where you think only of the present? And you don't evaluate yourself, think only of the present, and you relax. That was a huge deal. Forget the name of it now. It became very lucrative for consultants to make lots of money. Still not clear exactly what it means to me. So we have a lot of like in concept. These are the big things right now. They come and go.
Definitely another very interesting issue. We have spoken about many topics in relation to theory building, induction in psychology, and I would like now to wrap up. Is there something you would like to tell as a means of a summary, or is there something that you would like to add in regard to our discussion?
Well, I think my article in the if I don't have it in front of me, I'll send you a text or send you an attachment. Oh, wait a minute. I got it here. Okay. If you want a summary article of not all, but my life's work on goal setting, not all my work, life's work on goal setting by Latham and I. Organizational Psychology Review. Okay.
Okay.
2020, pages 1 through 19. So building a theory by induction, the example of goal setting theory. So if they want one article summarizing the process, not all the content, well, some of it, but the process, that's what I would recommend. If you want content, then I would start with our 1990 book, A Theory of Goal Setting and Task Performance.
Okay, I will definitely provide links to your book, to your various articles that we have mentioned or that you have mentioned in
I
a
wrote a book
description.
on free will, the illusion of determinism, why free will is real and causal. This really goes against the powers that be, who are hardcore determinists. For the most part, psychologists not quite so much. And this is what free will actually consists of and what it doesn't consist of, and why determinism, the idea that you have no control, contradicts itself and is hopeless. And there is causality in free will, but not mechanical causality. So that might interest people. It's available on Amazon.
Okay, thank you for that recommendation, and thank you for all today's discussion. It was really enjoyable, and it was especially enjoyable to see a prominent psychologist who is engaged with philosophy, or even to experience a scientist who is seriously engaged with philosophical literature. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and immense thank you for that experience.
Thank you for having me, and hope it didn't wear you out with so much material. But I hope people who want to do good theory building would be helped by the process that Latham and I used for 50, 60 years. So best wishes to you, and wherever you end up working. Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't hear your last sentence.
I would think good luck to you wherever you end up
Okay.
working, and hope you have a good career.
Okay, thank you a lot, and all the best to you too.
Thank you. I'm oh, I got to tell you this funny story. I'm 74 and 3/4. So I set a goal for longevity. So why not apply it to myself? The average male in the US lives to about 77. I think it's since COVID, 75 or 6. And I said, okay, my recommendation for businessmen is a clear but reachable, challenging but reachable goal. And I'm going to set a goal for my longevity. I made it 75. That's 7 or 8 years above male average in the US. That's challenging, but it's not ridiculous like 95. I might even make it. So that's just a fun application to myself.
Also aim for longevity, and I hope that being a philosopher will not hinder that goal.
Well, I think philosophy, people who deny philosophy, as Ayn Rand said, are always unknowing victims of previous philosophers. They just don't know it.
Okay, so again, thank you, and now to our listeners or viewers, if you liked if you like this interview and our discussion, please click a like button and tune in for future interviews and future materials.
Thank you.